I think for a long time I thought that history and journalism were irreconcilable. Like these were two different things I was interested in. Like, I'm interested in nursing, I'm interested in rock climbing, and just there's no real relationship. But I came to understand that the central organizing theme was narrative, and that I was interested in, both contemporary and historical narratives as ways of educating the public in terms of what's going on around them. To the more elegant summation of it, I think, is what Frederick Douglass said, whatever you work on also works on you.
You're working on a book about the shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a horrifying story. I think people are aware about the murders of 9 black parishioners while they were praying by a man who wrote that he did so because he wanted to start a race war. Can you talk about why you chose to write this book, whether you've come to a new understanding about the attack and what it means to the country?
I wrote that story because they say you should write the stories that you can't get away from, and that story is very difficult to get away from. Both physically, I had to keep going back to South Carolina to report and write about it, and psychologically and emotionally. And there were all these themes that kept emerging that started there. When I think I mentioned this before, and I was took pains then as now to assert that there's not a causal relationship between these two things, but Dylann Roof killed the people in the church the day after Donald Trump declared his presidential campaign. Dylann Roof said that he was committing these homicides because there were black rapists who were menacing white women. And Trump said he was running because they were Mexican rapists. And so we had this language of dark rapists menacing white women deployed twice within 24 hours in very different contexts, but they were responding to a common zeitgeist. And this is a kind of zeitgeist of siege, that there are very many white people who feel like they are besieged. And in the Obama years, there was a curious data point that began first a small plurality, a notable plurality of white people when polled on the questions of racial discrimination would say that whites were the most disadvantaged group in American society. And that number, it's quirky. There's no data to support that. There's no empirical reality that confirms that sentiment, but it is a very strongly held emotional reality for people. And over the course of the Obama years, that number increased and increased until in some public opinion polls, you were finding majorities of white people saying that the most disadvantaged group in American society is white people. Now, economically, that's not true. In terms of longevity, life expectancy, that's not true. In terms of life earnings, in terms of the value of your home, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of all of the benchmark relationships that we have with institutions pretty significantly point to white outcomes being more favorable than those of almost any other group. But that didn't really matter because there was a black dude in the White House. And so both Trump and Dylann Roof, were responses to that. And when I look at that moment in Charleston, it's almost like the shotgun that goes all these things that come out of. Happens on the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, happens on the 100th anniversary of the release of Birth of a Nation, happens in almost visual distance of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and happens in a church that was co-founded by Denmark Vesey, who was an ex-slave who tried to launch a slave revolt to free black people from bondage. All those kind of things wrapped up in this one moment. And finally, he's been disgustingly influential and inspirational to people like Robert Bowers, who shot 11 people in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and to Brenton Tarrant, who was the person who killed 50 Muslims in New Zealand just a couple weeks ago. And it's just a story that just keeps unfolding.
I have a question.
Yes.
Anthony Dandridge in Black Studies.
Mm-hmm.
Given your background in history and Black Studies,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think about the significance, and you were talking about this idea of different lenses through which you want to establish narratives when you look at certain events. The significance of cultural lenses. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Like to evaluate things. And I say that in some sense because my methodology that I am dominantly committed to is I'm an Afrocentrist. Right? But what do you think about the idea of cultural lenses?
I think that like our problems are primarily cultural. You know, and I learned that from Harold Cruz. So Harold Cruz, who wrote this book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, in 1967, which is hugely influential on me. I read it when I was about 23 years old, and you could feel like your neurons lighting up. And I think we all have those books that we encounter, and usually around that age. And I tracked Cruz down to a retirement home in Michigan and interviewed him, and we'd have like these conversations. And Cruz's big argument was about kind of the cultural implications and the cultural origins of what people would have been called the race problem in the United States. And when I say culture, I'm not necessarily talking about the plays that you see or the movies that you go to, or the food that you eat, or any of those kind of things. Although those are parts of it. But I really mean culture as a mechanism by which values are transmitted, across laterally and through generations. And so we have a cultural identity that has fairly efficiently bequeathed the ideas of white supremacy from one generation to the next in the United States. And that is not genetic. It's not in a kind of written doctrine of the United States, although we can kind of talk about the Constitution and those aspects of it, but it's been primarily cultural. And so when we say that we have to keep confronting this question, it's like, yeah, we still have the cultural pathogens that are passing these ideas down. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all know that journalism is a field that's in crisis for a whole bunch of reasons, from financial challenges to the widespread war on the media. There's one crisis that gets very little attention, and it's one we were having a conversation about here earlier, and that's the disconnect between the people who staff newsrooms, who are mostly white and disproportionately male, and the communities and readers they serve, who come from so many different communities, groups, ethnicities, and backgrounds. And you recently edited an issue of the Columbia Journalism Review about this whole issue called, and it's quote, "Missing the Story," in which you make the point that the relatively homogeneous media world is not democratic. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that idea, maybe implications for news readers of the disproportionately white and male newsroom, maybe suggestions for what you as a journalism faculty member, journalism educators, and educational leaders here might do, and how we should think about that.
Sure. So some of this is social and cultural too, going back to the previous question, because the other dynamic that's within this is that if we stepped out of like race and ethnicity as underrepresented categories and went to gender, it becomes explanatory in particular ways. So at Columbia, I want to not exaggerate this number. Safely, 65% of our students are female. I want to say it's like 70. And if it's not 70 this year, it has been 70. There's a very serious skew at CJS and at other journalism schools, very serious skew in law schools, certainly undergrad institutions. But then when we look at the numbers in the newsrooms, they plummet. Even in our own faculty, our faculty is about 2/3 male, and our student body is at least 2/3 female. And so that happens in newsrooms. So when people say that it's a pipeline problem to get more people of color into the newsrooms, you can say, sure, you can say that, but what happens to people who are already in your pipeline, who still don't show up in your newsrooms, and who still don't show up in executive positions, and don't become managing editor, and don't become editor-in-chief? And so what it says is that, again, we've been replicating the same model in ways. And so when you have a surplus, quote unquote, surplus of people, they still wind up with these numbers. When you have a dearth of people, they wind up with these numbers, which is kind of saying that somewhere the thumb is on the scale. And that happens, I think, in overt ways and then in subtle ways. I'm on the board of the Chancellor Awards, the John Chancellor Awards, which is, they're kind of like, it's like my philanthropic cousins, because the person who funds my position also funds the Chancellor Awards. And so, I kind of sit on the board of the awards, and one of the interesting things about, for people who are old enough to remember John Chancellor or who've ever seen him, he's this very distinguished, aristocratic almost figure with this impeccable enunciation, and you just kind of think that he, attended school in Cambridge, as I say, subtly, or a similar institution. Like, you think that that's his background. But Chancellor didn't go to college. He literally started out delivering newspapers. And then someone said, this kid who's delivering newspapers, let's give him a job in the newsroom. And he winds up being a copy boy. And then someone slaps a notepad and a pen in his hand and sends him out to report a story. And he does that for a while, and then when television kind of starts, someone sticks him in front of a camera, and then they realize that they need anchors, and someone sits him at a desk. But at each step, someone had the idea hey, John could do this. And meaning that they were open to the idea of the person who, as we're creating this thing called an anchor, we're open to the idea of that person looking like you. And when we walk in with the preconceived ideas of who should be in a position, even if we're not doing it overtly, we replicate it in these ways that have real implications. Like we're missing the story. David Carr, who gave me my start in journalism, he was at the Washington City paper, which was in a city that was at that point about almost 70% Black, and had one Black person who wrote for them semi-regularly, and very tense relations with Black Washingtonians. And David Carr, who kind of walked in, it's almost like the setup for a sitcom. He came in from Minnesota with this very Midwestern practicality. Are you a Minnesotan?
No, but I lived there for 19 years.
Yeah, I was wondering, because you said an O in a way, and I was like, okay. I was waiting, I was kind of homing in. You have GPS that's kind of locating something. I was like, all right, I'm in the general upper Midwest, keep talking.
You got
it. So, but he came in, it was with this very Midwestern practicality, and almost naive sensibility. If I'm correct, the words that David literally used when people were saying there are no Black writers here was something to the effect of, we gotta get some of those. He could have just as well meant I have to go to the store and get eggs. I was perfectly fine with this because I was one of those that he got. But his first foray, he created an internship program. His first foray was that he got me, Neil Drumming, who's now a producer at This American Life, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. That was his freshman class of interns.
Wow.
Just looking around and saying, who have we not invited into the fold? And so he did for us what these various other people did for John Chancellor.
So it's not enough to think about pipeline issues in particular, as we talk about often in STEM education, about leaks in the pipeline, but how to stuff the right people into the pipeline.
Right, and how to make this pipeline bigger and broader. And so when we have the small pipelines, everything has to be, you're counting every single person. As opposed to when I was 15, I participated in this science program, the summer science program, and they recruited these kids. These were some very forward-thinking people from the National Science Foundation created this program where they took us from our high schools to City College in Manhattan, and we did this intensive science thing all summer. They were trying to create the next generation of scientists and trying to diversify the pipeline. I obviously did not go into science, but what I did get was a lifelong love of science. And now, when we're talking about needing a more scientifically literate public, like I am every science magazine I can get my hands on, but if I weren't so wrapped up in race, I probably would be a science writer, and I keep trying to sneak over into that. But I think that still winds up being a victory for that pipeline.
Thank you. Another question?
Do you know if there are any journalism schools that have recruiting, black or other colored people?
That's a good question.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, so with me, I do like the kind of informal recruitment stuff at Columbia, but I don't know that there's a kind of initiative to say that we're trying to get more people of color. And so my kind of backdoor version of that has been that I just got funding to do journalism workshops in Harlem, since Columbia is, basically in Harlem. Don't tell anybody. I brought a friend to campus, and we were like right by the verge of the park, and we like stepped over into the park, and I was like, now you're in Harlem. Now you're not, but I just got funding to do that kind of thing, which is bringing people to campus and giving them access to resources at Columbia. So that can be like at least one avenue of it. But I don't know of anybody doing that really intensively or aggressively.
As a historian and journalist, to what extent are you involved in or is it appropriate to be involved in solutions and recommending solutions? And if you do go to those places, then how do we solve, or is there a solution in your view, to the hold on the pipeline that the gatekeepers have? I mean, how do you get them to cede control?
Yeah, well, the gatekeepers are trying to hold on to the gates, at this point, because media is diversified in so many different ways. And there are all of these platforms that people can explore, that they can publish on. And that's been great, in the democratizing sense of it. Also, of course, when we get more of anything, most of what we get isn't good. It's the 80-20 rule. And so what I think gatekeepers wind up doing, what we used to have are gatekeepers, and what we now have are people who are more like curators. So they don't determine whether or not you get published, but they can determine the prestige of the institution that publishes you. And that has a certain place, a certain niche, especially one of the things that I think is a challenge for this moment in journalism is that there are people who are practitioners who don't necessarily know ethics, certainly don't know legal boundaries. I know a freelance journalist who just got hit with a $250,000 libel settlement, and this is coming out of his pocket because there's no institution that's covering him for this. And so I think that those things are really big concerns. In terms of the other parts of solutions, I mean, a lot of what I do is opinion journalism, so I have like an idea of kind of posing, what I think should happen is like in that context of things. But I've always said this. I've gone to many institutions where the athletic departments are like, I go to the athletic department and I think I'm in Harlem. And then I go to like the other parts of the campus and I think I'm in Vermont. And so it's the effort that goes into finding, I mean, for talented athletes, there are people being scouted in junior high school. 11, 12, 13 years old, people were saying, we think you have athletic potential. But we're not going into those communities and saying, I think you can be a physicist, or I think that you can be a writer. And I think that, for me, it's very personal. And if like you give me 2 minutes, I can become very indignant about it because I start thinking about the zip code that I grew up in, and none of my peers are professors. And a significant number of my peers are not alive. And I had a handful of interventions, from my 9th grade teacher who told me he thought I was smart, to being blessed with parents who stuck me in a public library and opened up that entire world to me. But just statistically, I'm not supposed to be doing what I'm doing. And we are generally okay with people's life outcomes being intensely correlated to what their zip code is. Socially, not I'm saying any individual in this room, but societally, we've made the decision that we're okay with that. Until we're willing to say that we're as interested in recruiting these young people to say, like, maybe you want to be a graphic designer, maybe you can actually be, maybe you can design cars, you know? Maybe there are all these kinds of things that you show the potential to do. We'll still be having a conversation about pipelines, 20 years from now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned getting your start at the Washington City paper, which is an alternative weekly. And now you contribute to major national news organizations like the New Yorker, MSNBC, This American Life. Can you talk about what it was like working for the Washington City paper? Maybe share perspective on the role of local news, and maybe some reflections on what a media outlet like that can do that major news organizations perhaps cannot.
Oh, absolutely. The Washington City paper was a madhouse, but in the best possible way. And David Carr, who was quite an eccentric figure, I can tell you the exact first conversation that I had with him, which is that Ta-Nehisi and I were friends from school, and he mentioned that he was going to write for the city paper, and I was like, "You're crazy." And he was like, "No, they have a new editor. You should meet him." And I was like, "Nah." And he said, "No, seriously." And I was like, "Okay." So I send him a note, and he invites me to come in. And I walk into his office, and this is like the 90s, so it's like not digital. I had like this folder with like my clips in it. And I walk into this office, and his office is dark, but he's sitting at his desk. And I go to flick the light on, and he says, no, don't turn the light on. I spend a lot of time in dark crack houses, and I still can't deal with overhead light. That is literally the first thing that Carr ever said to me. And I was like, this guy is not serious. And then I later learned, no, he really did spend a lot of time in dark crack houses. He can't deal with overhead light. And so I gave him my clips. He read them in the semi-dark and was like, "Oh, this is good. When can you start?" And that was it. That was the conversation we had. And the thing that, first off, local news is important for 1,000 reasons. One is that people are more likely to trust their local news outlets, and that's the point where people have very little trust in media. It's partly because these are people that you don't know. And even when we talk about the kind of moment of populism that we're in now, populists have historically in this country had a great deal of distrust for powerful institutions. Most of the time, those institutions have been banks. But government, banks, kind of nameless, powerful entities. And it's no coincidence that the changing business model has cratered local news, and trust in media has plummeted because the news that they do interact with, the media company is as big as the bank that you don't trust. And so it fits into that same sort of category, like reasonably. It's not surprising that happens. And so, when you get to like the granular level of people doing local reporting, that's like really great. But the other thing that happens is that you are allowed something that I think young journalists don't get very much now. You are allowed to get things wrong, and you're allowed to make mistakes. Not that any publication sets out for you to get things wrong, but it's a more forgiving environment when you screw up something and you have to print a retraction for 15,000 readers as opposed to 5 million, or more. And then there's a secondary life online. So 3 years later, people are still reminding you that you got that name wrong, and therefore people shouldn't trust you and so on. And I think that that's a very difficult challenge for young journalists who are coming up now.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yes.
I'd like to go back to this pipeline issue. I grew up in the Bronx, and if you could do stuff academically, you went to Bronx Science.
Mhm.
There were other kids from Manhattan, and some from all the way from Brooklyn, but I'd say it was 90%, maybe 95% Jewish.
Mhm.
I went in the 50s, early 50s. And, like just a scattering. I remember one black kid in our class.
Mhm.
That was it. I've been following the debate about the
Mhm.
specialized high
Mhm.
schools. And I was really shocked when I saw this figure 6, the number of kids who were invited to, I don't know if it was just
Mhm.
science or
Mhm.
either
It's about
science.
science,
Yeah. And I'm an alumnus, therefore I get the alumni, and a lot of controversy about
Mhm.
this. We don't want to dilute the kind of education
Mhm.
which we got, but the kind of education we got really catapulted people from very poor homes
Mhm.
in the Bronx mostly, but working class homes, but who could do something academically.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering whether there's anybody talking about how to prepare kids who who don't score. I mean, I saw this proposal of, the top 10 kids from every class.
Mhm.
But education is so different for kids, the preparation would be so lacking
Mhm.
that you would have to put in some kind of, I don't know, call it remedial, whatever. So I'm wondering, I don't know where you went to high school, but I think it was in the city, wasn't it?
I went to Jamaica High School.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, there are good teachers at every high school,
Mhm.
but the programs, the fellow students, everything makes a big difference about what your future is gonna be and what pipeline you're channeled into.
Mhm.
I was
So
wondering-
it's interesting that you would say this because just today, actually, I'm sitting on a dissertation committee, and it's a young historian named Matthew Goriglia who wrote his dissertation on the history of the NYPD. And one of the more compelling parts of it is the fight for a civil service exam. And the testing for the schools, for the specialized schools, kind of mirrors this in a particular way. That people really wanted a civil service exam for policing, because otherwise the police were basically gangs that ward bosses put together and political people hired. You put your cousin on the police force and so on. It was just a hotbed of corruption. And they felt that by creating one test across the board, you have to pass this test. If you pass the test, you get invited into the academy. That would uproot the old mechanisms that that favored people for reasons that were unfair. And in that regard, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that makes a lot of sense in the educational system as well. I think that we have to do a better job of preparing students of color and low-income students for these tests. And one of the other things about it is that now the specialized high schools are kind of like life rafts, which they never were supposed to be. They were supposed to be the elite institutions of a overall functioning system. But now people are kind of like, what if we hadn't thought of American higher education as you go to Harvard or every other college in the country sucks? Like, it would distort all kinds of things about the relationship that people have to Harvard. Although I just read this report today about like Harvard's admissions, it's like they're pretty distorted anyway. And it's also kind of like, I went to Jamaica High School in the city, not specialized high school, but Jamaica was, during the time that I was there, the Department of Education selected it as one of the top 50 public schools in the United States. Francis Ford Coppola went to my high school. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee went to my high school. Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, who was one of the most notable alum. And trust me, if you take a class with a teacher who taught Stephen Jay Gould biology, you will know that this person taught Stephen Jay Gould biology. And so the education that I got from there, we could have paid for that in a private school. There's no guarantee that the education I got at a private school would have been any better than what I got at Jamaica High School. Like, those people were superheroes in my book. Because we have these systems that are not functioning, generally, we have this whole other conversation. And so I think that there are like two things. One, we need to actually be pointing resources into these communities so that the kids who can take those tests do, and that they are able to do well on them. And two, I think that there should not be the kind of desperation to get into those schools anyway, because we need a much better functioning public education system in the city.
I might take a moment to brag about our educational opportunity program. It does not address the K through 12 issues, but it's a statewide program. Ours is the second largest among the SUNY comprehensive campuses. And it's for students who have great potential, but they come from academically impoverished backgrounds, most often because they've been at poor urban or rural schools, and they come from low-income families. And our program is immensely successful. We're constrained financially, or we could, if we could increase this program by orders of magnitude, we would do so in a heartbeat. But the challenges you raise are clearly compelling. Anthony?
There was an event that happened in the last 2 weeks, and I'm not sure how much you might know about the situation, but I just wanted you to give your thoughts on it in some general sense. It can be tied into a variety of different things we talked about already. In Savannah, Georgia, there's a mayoral race going on down there. And there is a forum held at a church, and they said only black media allowed. Right. Are you familiar with that particular incident? Okay, and well, just me putting it forth, what do you think about that? So I think there were 3 or 4 black mayoral candidates that actually attended. And then the blowback was, okay, that was racist, right? So I mean, it can be viewed through a variety of different lenses. I don't know if you care to engage it at all, but again.
I mean, I think that the kind of line about who's allowed kind of breeds trouble, because politicians do media sessions with particular media all the time. As a matter of fact, writing about Stacey Abrams, she just did this thing with Latino media. And it wasn't like if there was a non-Latino person, they were going to kick them out, but it was kind of a program that was designated for Latino media. And so I don't think that, I just don't think it's necessary to say, like, you can't come if you're not black. Like, that creates a bar that is not useful and winds up is being more trouble than it's worth. And I don't even know that it's defensible legally. I mean, I was just talking about the New Yorker has been, there've been this a long, ongoing, about year-long now effort to unionize the New Yorker writers, which is like the New Yorker union meetings are very genteel and speaks with their indignation, but at a very moderate tone. But I think that that's really important, because, for just tons of reasons. You have people who don't have like any kind of job security. You have people who are being paid wages that they can't live on. You have people who don't have health insurance. We have people who are, and these are full-time employed journalists. And at the same time, there are hedge fund owners who are kind of cratering businesses. In Denver, the paper out there where they had that huge issue where they actually started reporting on themselves about what their owners were doing with the profits from the company. And it was viable if you weren't trying to maximize and wring every single cent that you could get. You were actually willing to invest in making a sustainable publication that could work. But that wasn't what the interest was. And so it's the same sort of conflict that we have about labor in lots of other contexts, but maybe we're not accustomed to to journalism having to confront it. And I also think it's true that now, because journalism is an industry that didn't always have a mostly college educated workforce, that we now are kind of like, we think that I have a bachelor's degree or I have a master's degree, I'm not supposed to be unionizing, you know? That's for the people who kind of graduated from high school and got a pen and a pad and started writing. And because of the way that the labor market has changed, like, yeah, that's what we have to do now.
So you're speaking with a group of many faculty here who are part of a collective bargaining group, statewide faculty union.
Mhm.
I'm going to ask this question with a little bit of trepidation because as a public officer, I try to not reveal my political leanings. And I would offer a disclaimer here that I'm not trying to do that, but nobody would believe me anyway. I've been reading your book, The Substance of Hope, which is about the 2008 election of Barack Obama as U.S. president. And you wrote about what his election told us about change, about lack of change in some areas, about America's political and social landscape, and the relationship of that election to the civil rights movement. And you published that book in 2010, and I'm wondering if you could write a short postscript now in 2019, what would be 2 or 3 themes or assessments that you might emphasize?
So there's a theme that I was thinking about, but I didn't put into the book. And I would put it in now, and I put it in prominently, and that is that when that moment of like euphoria that was happening, where people were saying that, you know, we were post-racial and all that, if we can just take a pause for this, like just put a pin in this and come back to it. There was something about that post-racial conversation that never sat well with me. And, you know, in 2008, Obama won like 42%, I think it was 42% of white voters, which was interesting because he got more than John Kerry got and more than Al Gore had gotten, 8 years before. But, you know, still 42% of white people voted for him. And on the basis of something that a minority of white people had done, it was just kind of game over, we're done with race, you know, we're post-racial. It's like,
Right.
in short, 42% of white people did, in voting for a candidate who did not share their racial background, 42% of white people did what nearly 100% of black people have been doing since we got the chance to vote. But nobody came up and said, oh, look at the Negroes, we're post-racial. Like, they're willing to not hold FDR's race against him, you know? They're not holding JFK's whiteness against him. They actually came out and voted for him. And so it was a very self-congratulatory stance to take. And there was this storm cloud that would seem to mess up the euphoria. But quietly, people had these conversations. A friend of mine who works in politics said this to me. And this was a few weeks before the election. It was looking like Obama was closing in on the presidency. And we're talking about it. He said, you know there's going to be hell to pay for this, don't you? And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, and you know the Voting Rights Act is gone. And I said, yeah, I know. And in 2012, 2013, the Supreme Court essentially struck down the Voting Rights Act. The Tea Party movement that morphed into all these other kinds of things, the birtherism, the idea that, you know, so listen, I'll get you off the partisan hook here, because everything that I said about Donald Trump in 2016, I'd said about Donald Trump when he was a Democrat. So his switch of party affiliation did not change my fundamental assessment of his character. But the voluminous lies and manufacturing this idea that the president was not a citizen, therefore wasn't even eligible to vote in the election he actually won. And the fact that people could believe this, or this would not be disqualifying. And not only that, you would select this person to replace the first black president. You couldn't predict that specifically, but the history of the United States has demonstrated that. But whenever we've had a moment of progress, we've had a moment of resentment and backlash that's been driven by it. There was, as I said at the talk, when people say to me like, when will black people get over slavery? And I always respond, when will black people get over emancipation? Like, we go to places where people are still feeling victimized because they don't have the right to own people anymore. And that dynamic, freedom, fundamentally, you can't rape and buy these people anymore, created a backlash in American society where people were murdered. The migration that people participated in to get out of the regions where they were being lynched and denied the right to vote generated a backlash that brought stronger segregation to the north and rioting and Boston saying we will not bust kids into these schools. The civil rights movement, the people saying that we want things that are actually in the Constitution, generated a backlash that we saw. Very intense political backlash. There was no way that the election of a black president was not going to do the same thing. And if we had been honest with ourselves, we didn't know what it was going to look like. And no fiction writer would have thought that it would have taken the form that it ultimately has taken. But we now have actual white supremacists as a part of the American political spectrum. Like, they're not on the fringe anymore. Like, this is not 1948 with the Dixiecrats. Like, this is 2016, 2017, 2019. And people are taking these sentiments of white nationalists into concern when they decide what policies they'll enact or what statements they'll make or whatever. And so, yeah, that's what I would put in that book. That I only told half the story, and I probably fault myself for not saying like what my friend said to me when we had that one moment of honest reflection, that would be held to pay for this.
Question?
Sorry if that's a downer.
I'd be curious to know what your assessment is of Obama now on some of his more conservative things he did, like he sent more people out of the country than Trump has.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of flaws.
He was tougher to get information under the Freedom of Information Act than any president before him.
Not since this one though, or I think this one is probably.
Maybe he's outdoing it.
Yeah, it's outdone him. So I think there are a couple things with Obama that we could be very critical. I mean, a few things. One, I think that, so if we look at the critique that as a candidate, Obama launched against Bush, which was the extra constitutionality of the Bush administration, particularly around things like the Iraq War. And people sold Obama as a constitutional law professor. So he's a person who understands better the limits of the executive branch. Except understanding those limits and being tempted to step beyond those limits are two different things. And they aggregated power to the executive branch in ways that we should find disturbing too, especially around the seizure of information, I think it was with the Associated Press, which set a precedent that was very concerning. Now we're looking at things with a overtly hostile administration and its relationship to media, with a tool that has effectively been handed to them by people who should have known better. And so I think there's that. I think there's, on the deportation policy, Obama had this thing that he did that really characterized all 8 years of his tenure, which was that he would run full speed into a brick wall and then dust himself off and go, that was odd, and run full speed into that same brick wall. And that brick wall was largely Republican opposition to things. So he thought that by, the explanation that people have given me when I've talked to people from the administration was that they thought that by coming down hard on deportation, they would give Republicans room to negotiate something in the middle. And the old political tactics, maybe under the old regime that would have worked, but this wasn't really, I think the strange thing about Obama is that he was curiously ill-equipped to understand how racism works in American society. In 2008, he understood something that most black people didn't, where he was far less cynical about white people, I'm just being honest, far less cynical about white people than probably is the default setting for most black people who grew up in the United States. He'd grown up in Indonesia, he'd had the best white grandparents in the world, he had this education that exposed him to a very different world. He did not have, like, my father telling him, like, what happened to him in Jim Crow, Georgia. And my father's advice to me being, my father was torn. He was Catholic and really took to heart the universalism of the Catholic Church and the messages about of all being God's children and so on, but he was also a person who grew up in segregated Georgia. So in the same week, my father could tell me that nothing matters about a person except their character, and the only thing that you care about is how they treat you. And then like 2 days later, he'd be like, never ever doubt what white people are capable of doing to you in this world. It just depends on how much he'd been thinking about Georgia that week, would determine like how his view of the world was. Obama did not have that. And so he proved all of us wrong, because nobody thought that 42% of white people would vote for a black presidential candidate, and he was right about that. Up until January of 2009, when there were things that black people who grew up in the United States, who understood race in particular ways that he would have said cynical, but we understood some things that he did not. And he suffered for that. He didn't understand that the opposition to him was entrenched and it was about who he was, not like what policy he was advocating. The same thing with healthcare, where he kind of thought that he thought that it would matter that he was taking a Republican plan. Like, and then even when, I forget who it was, the Republican congressman who was kind of going on, he like said, they threw out these negotiations after like these marathon discussions. He was like, you tell me what deal we could actually make on healthcare. And then he said, I have to tell you, there's no deal we can make. So it literally was not about policy whatsoever. Like, this is about you. Or Merrick Garland, where he actually thought that picking a moderate would allow him to get someone on the Supreme Court. And I think the deportation thing was part of that. I think if we remember not the Valdez, off the Gulf of Mexico,
Deepwater Horizon.
the Deepwater Horizon.
Right.
British.
With that, BP.
Yeah.
With the BP leak, they had just relaxed those regulations, and they wound up with this massive oil leak, this ecological disaster. But they relaxed those regulations because they thought that the Republicans were going to come down on something in the middle on climate change. And again, they got nothing. It was like Charlie Brown with the football. And so I think there's a lot that you could criticize him for in a kind of impermissible, or guns. And just start and just go, like the whole thing. It's like a kind of impermissible level of naivete. I'm like the most downer person you've ever had.
So since we're already on that downward spiral,
I'm going to talk about only happy things for the remainder of this conversation.
well, I've got one more downer question here. So you've really, you've described a fractured and paranoid moment in our history. At the same time, we see a bottoming out of trust in major institutions, including the press. And so how do you see the role of the media moving ahead in protecting or returning American democracy?
So here's the thing, I'm optimistic. And I know people are like, really? I hate to see you like when you're really down. But I am optimistic. And James Baldwin said, I have to be an optimist because I'm alive, you know? And I think that that's it. And so, but I was talking with, I forget who it was I was talking with. I talk a lot. But I said that we have a kind of naive idea of optimism, that we think of it as like exuberance, like irrational exuberance. Like everything's gonna be great, we're just happy, like it'll work out, you know, or it'll be okay, and it really might not be okay, but we call that optimism. That's not really optimism. I said, I have the kind of optimism that a boxer has going into the 11th round, which means that whatever has happened, you've been able to sustain it. All of it has hurt. Some of it has damaged you. But at the very least, you know that you have enough in the tank to finish this out. And that you might actually win. And I think that's the kind of realistic idea of optimism that I try to practice. As it pertains to media, I'm always mindful that, like, we have faced tremendous obstacles. This is like the kind of boxer's optimism that history provides. That when we actually look at the kind of depressing aspects of the past, what we get as a result, as a reward, like the kind of prize in the Cracker Jack box of history, is that we get a sense of what people did to get through those moments. And the fact that those moments were survivable. And so in that context, I think that Marty Barron is completely right. He says that the administration is at war with journalists, but journalists are not at war with the administration. We're just doing our jobs. And I think that they're big questions about how you create local media. I don't know the answer to it. If I did, I promise you I would be doing it. But people are doing kind of diligent experimentation and finding out what works, what might not work, what are the models that can prove to be sustainable. And I think that those things, I have hope from the people who, the history of the press in this country is like one of a very persecuted institution. Like in the point in time in the 19th century where it was like not uncommon at all to shoot editors-in-chief dead. There was one town, like one of my mentors, David Oshinsky, wrote about where I want to say it was like 4 editors. Like you publish something someone didn't like, they just shoot you. And it was in Mississippi. And I mean, we're not getting shot literally at this point. Well, there actually was the Capitol Gazette newsroom, but that's not the kind of default for American media at this moment. Or the abolitionists who get their printing presses destroyed and so on. And so maybe we look a little bit at what our colleagues have done in the past. Or maybe we look a little bit abroad about the reporting that people have managed to do under very difficult and adverse circumstances. And maybe we kind of say that we have a lot of difficulty ahead of us, but we have enough in the tank to get through it.
And I can see that the historical perspective makes a difference in how we think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura?
So, if you believe in agenda setting theory, the media has always been selecting stories, but the whole mainstream media thing that is kind of part of the public conversation now, which seems to have started with more conservative folk, but has really spread. I think. Is there a way out of that? Do we come out of that in a way where we are able to again say lots of different kinds of media have value?
You mean the agenda setting in what sense?
Well, I just mean like now we all of a sudden people are real suspicious. Like the media's telling us what to think and they're directing our attention and it's not nothing new is going on, but there's this public perception that something new is going on.
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of like the founders of this country, where they had suspicion of like power being concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, but they were also smart enough to have suspicion of power being diffused out, and recognizing that the public could be the stronghold of democracy, or they could also be like really crazy. And so we have on the one hand that people don't trust mainstream media, and the gatekeeping or agenda setting or those kinds of things, the parameters of conversation are no longer really controlled by a handful of powerful institutions, or just 3. When I was a child, just 3 TV networks or whatever. So that is done. On the flip side, we have things like Pizzagate, you know, that gets, we have birtherism, we have QAnon, it has never been easier to be paranoid in America. There's never been a better time to be paranoid. Like, you can find your kin very easily, and you can kind of hide under the bed together. And so those conversations are happening outside of the mainstream media. And so a lot of times you hear this conversation, they'll say, the media won't tell you, and ... And it was like, a lot of times the media won't tell you that because it's not true. You know, sometimes there are, very often there are, and I'm not comfortable with saying that the media, like the old system was great, because I think even tying this back into the other question about diversity and the lack thereof, like that we inherited from that old system. They bequeathed that to this moment. But there were benefits to it. In the kind of ruling out things that shouldn't take up as much public attention as they do. And now there's no referee. And if you attempt to be a referee, it's like, that's the clearest way to get people to believe that you're in on the conspiracy.
Dr. Cobb, thank you for sharing your experience, your insight, your wisdom, and for taking us to the end of this round.